Ma'am, you're acting suspicious. What exactly are you doing here? Tanya Wells tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a polite but firm smile. Suspicious? I'm here for my checkup. Is that a crime? Officer Jack Reynolds adjusted his belt, his badge glinting as he crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. Don't play smart with me. I've seen your kind loitering around places you don't belong. Her smile faltered. My kind? What does that mean? Last I checked, this was a hospital for everyone. Jack's jaw tightened, his voice dropping a notch laced with threat. Watch your tone. Don't make me take you in for questioning. For sitting in a wheelchair and existing? Tanya's words were calm, yet each syllable sliced through the tension like a blade. Jack leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. Don't test me, lady. You people think you can pull scams like this, pretending you need help and scamming unsuspecting and well-to-do white people. I've seen it all before. Tanya inhaled deeply, her expression steady, but her voice carried a controlled fire. Scams? You're making assumptions based on nothing but your own bias. That badge must be really heavy on your conscience. Bystanders had started to notice, their gazes flicking nervously between the officer and the woman. A man in a white coat hesitated at the hospital's entrance but didn't step forward. Jack's patience snapped. You're walking a thin line, ma'am, he snarled. And you're stepping way over it, Tanya shot back, her tone sharper now, her impatience growing. The moment hung in the air like a taut wire ready to snap. Then it happened. Jack's fist flew, striking her across the face. The force tipped her wheelchair, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. A collective gasp rose from the few witnesses, but no one moved. Tanya's sunglasses clattered to the ground, revealing a tear-streaked face contorted in pain. Jack stood over her, his chest heaving with anger. Maybe next time you'll watch your mouth, dirty ugly monkey, he said smugly before turning on his heel. He didn't spare a glance back. To him, she was nothing more than a helpless, crippled black woman. As Jack walked away, Tanya remained on the ground, clutching her cheek, her body trembling. But it wasn't just pain in her eyes. She was thirsty for revenge. Quietly, she whispered to herself, "You'll regret this." Before we get into this story, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support and spread awareness. Now let's get into it. Back at the hospital, Tanya dusted herself and hauled herself back into her wheelchair and then stopped a cab that took her home. Back at her apartment, she shut the door, locking it with a quiet click. The bruise on her cheek throbbed, a sharp reminder of the day's events. She ignored the pain, rolling her wheelchair into the room. The space was modest but efficient, every inch optimized for her covert work. Monitors hummed softly on a cluttered desk, displaying live feeds and stored surveillance footage. Maps and photographs covered the walls, connected by red strings tracing the tangled web of her investigation. When Tanya reached the center of the room, she paused. She gripped the armrests of her chair, pushing herself up. Standing slowly, she stretched her legs, shaking off the discomfort of hours spent pretending to be disabled. The wheelchair, like everything else in her life, was part of the mission. She crossed to the desk, opening a drawer and retrieving a black file. The cover was worn because of how often she'd combed through its contents. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the documents and photographs inside. Her brother's face stared back at her. Jamal Wells had been a bright, healthy 28-year-old when he'd checked into that hospital for a simple flu. It should have been a routine checkup, but days later, he'd gone missing. His body was found floating in a river, and all of his organs were gone. The police had called it animal activity, and the case remained unsolved for years, but Tanya had never believed their prognosis. The system had failed him, and she vowed it wouldn't fail anyone else. Her investigation had started here, that hospital. The same hospital where the racist and cruel cop harassed and assaulted her a few minutes ago. Over the years, she'd uncovered suspicious deaths, missing patients, and unexplained transplants. But what she found most damning was the frequent presence of Officer Jack Reynolds. Tanya clicked on her laptop, pulling up archived CCTV footage. Jack's face appeared again and again. He was always lingering near the hospital, chatting with staff, and there was a van he was always going into and coming out of a few blocks away from the hospital. His behavior was too consistent to be a coincidence. There was something there, and she was going to find out what it was. Today's confrontation in front of the hospital confirmed her suspicions. Jack hadn't just been an arrogant, racist cop. He was involved in protecting something, or some people. Tanya studied a grainy photo of him shaking hands with a man in scrubs. The man's face was partially obscured, but the body language suggested that they were familiar. Her jaw tightened. Jack Reynolds wasn't just a dirty cop. He was deeply tied to the organ harvesting ring she was chasing. She was sure of it now. Closing the file, Tanya leaned back against the desk, determination burning in her eyes. "You've been hiding in plain sight," she muttered under her breath. "But not anymore." And so the investigations on Officer Jack began. She started by keeping tabs on his every move. As Tanya adjusted the camera lens from her parked car, positioned a safe distance from Jack Reynolds' modest suburban home, she thought about how many people may have died in Jack's hand. It was an early evening, the soft glow of porch lights illuminating the quiet street. From her vantage point, she could see Jack's truck in the driveway. He was home for now. For the past 3 days, Tanya had followed Jack's every move. She tailed him from his house to the precinct, to local diners, and most importantly, to the hospital. Her suspicion deepened with each passing day. Jack's movements were routine during the day, coffee, patrols, and a visit to the station, but his nights painted a darker picture. He often lingered at the hospital long after visiting hours, slipping through side entrances and meeting with unfamiliar figures. On one occasion, Tanya observed him loading something in a bag into the back of a van parked near the hospital's loading dock. The driver, a man in scrubs, didn't seem surprised by Jack's presence. Tanya kept meticulous notes and pictures. Every interaction, every exchange, every subtle gesture was documented. But she needed more than observations. She needed hard evidence. They all would come in handy when she nailed him. And she was going to nail him. Back at her apartment, Tanya activated a secure laptop and logged into a CIA database using encrypted credentials. Within minutes, she had Jack's file on her screen. As she skimmed through the records, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Jack Reynolds had a long history of misconduct. Complaints of brutality and excessive force littered his record, but none had escalated to formal charges. Witnesses recanted, investigations stalled, and Jack always walked away unscathed. Tanya wasn't surprised. Corrupt cops like him think they are above the law. They always found a way to escape repercussions. What caught her attention, though, was a flagged incident from 2 years ago. Jack had been implicated in a smuggling operation involving medical supplies, but the case was quietly dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Tanya's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't just medical supplies he was smuggling, it was organs, an assault, and a lot of other heinous crimes. He was going down. She would make sure of it. Her surveillance confirmed her suspicions. Jack wasn't just a pawn in the ring, he was actively facilitating it. The frequent meetings at the hospital, the van, and the late-night visits weren't coincidences. As she closed the file, Tanya stared at the wall of evidence she'd assembled. Jack Reynolds was the key to dismantling the organ harvesting network. She leaned back, her resolve firm. "It's only a matter of time," she murmured, her voice steady. "You'll slip up and I'll be ready." I hope you have subscribed to my channel. Thank you for your support so far. You are amazing. Like, share, and hit the subscribe button right away. Tanya Wells sat at her desk, surrounded by the glow of her monitors. The air in her apartment was heavy with tension, broken only by the faint hum of her equipment. On one screen, live surveillance footage showed Officer Jack Reynolds pacing the parking lot of the hospital. On another, an audio file played, crackling with the sound of his voice. "Getting the next shipment ready," Jack's words came through clearly. followed by the muffled response of another man. Tanya rewound the recording, listening again. The conversation had been intercepted from a tapped burner phone Jack used frequently. His tone was casual, almost businesslike, as if he were discussing an ordinary delivery. But Tanya knew better. The term shipment wasn't innocuous. It was a code, part of the organ harvesting ring's operations. She scribbled notes furiously, linking dates, locations, and individuals she'd observed. Her wall of evidence was growing, every thread leading back to Jack. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she cross-referenced names from her CIA database. The man on the other end of Jack's phone call was flagged as a known trafficker with connections to underground medical networks. Tanya's eyes narrowed. She was closing in on the ring, and Jack was the linchpin. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. To bring down the operation, she needed undeniable proof. The recording was a start, but it wasn't enough to implicate Jack and his accomplices. She had to catch him in the act. Rising from her chair, Tanya moved to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside were her tools, recording devices, a compact camera, and a concealed microphone. She tested each piece, ensuring they were fully functional. Her reflection in the darkened monitor caught her attention. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, a reminder of the confrontation that had sparked this phase of her investigation. She touched it lightly, her resolve hardening. She called for backup, and they headed to the outskirts of town. Their investigations had led them to this eerie, cold place, and the night was moonless, the abandoned building silhouetted against the dark sky. Tanya Wells crouched behind a cluster of rusted barrels, her camera trained on the dimly lit area where Jack Reynolds had just parked his van. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady, her finger hovering over the record button. Jack stepped out of the van, glancing around the desolate lot before opening the rear doors. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces partially obscured by hoods. Tanya zoomed in, capturing every movement. Her breath caught when Jack dragged a teenage boy out of the van. The boy was gagged and tied, his hospital gown torn and dirtied. He stumbled as Jack yanked him forward, his wide, terrified eyes darting around the scene. Tanya's jaw tightened. They were abducting people from the hospital and bringing them to this place and taking their organs, then dumping their bodies later on. Little wonder her brother had gone missing. This was how her brother died. "Focus," she whispered to herself, adjusting the camera to get a clearer shot. She recorded the exchange as Jack handed the boy off to one of the men, who shoved the teenager toward the building. Jack gestured toward the van, saying something Tanya couldn't hear, but his body language was commanding, almost smug. Tanya's hand slipped into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She kept her voice low as she called her CIA team, relaying the situation. "I've got visual confirmation," she murmured. "Teenage victim, hospital gown, gagged, location matches the intel. They're inside now. Go in, immediately." Her team responded swiftly, confirming they were going in. Tanya returned her attention to the scene, recording every second. Jack and the men began unloading coolers from the van, their actions precise and practiced. Tanya's stomach churned. She knew what those coolers were for. Moments later, faint lights approached from the distance. Tanya recognized the unmarked vehicles of her team, moving in with coordinated precision. She held her breath as the vehicles screeched to a stop, agents pouring out with weapons drawn. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" One of the agents barked, their voice cutting through the tense air. The men scattered, but there was nowhere to go. Jack reached for his sidearm, but an agent tackled him to the ground, disarming him in seconds. The teenager, still gagged and tied, was quickly pulled to safety by another agent. Tanya stepped out of the shadows, her camera still recording. She watched as Jack was handcuffed, his face twisted in fury and panic. The men were rounded up, their operation exposed. As the scene unfolded, Tanya exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. The ring was dismantled, the victim saved. Justice was finally within reach. As you would expect, cases with this kind of weight end up in court, and so it did. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Officer Jack Reynolds sat at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched and his expression defiant. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding presence, stood before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, holding up a series of photos. "These are images of the defendant, Jack Reynolds, coordinating with known members of an organ harvesting ring. The evidence you are about to see will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is guilty of kidnapping, assault, organ harvesting, conspiracy, and murder." The jury's eyes were riveted to the screens as Tanya Wells' recordings played. The video showed Jack dragging the teenage boy from the van, handing him over to the group of men. The audio captured his voice discussing shipments and arranging meetings. The clarity of the footage left little room for doubt. The prosecutor continued, calling witnesses to the stand. Hospital employees testified about Jack's frequent late-night visits and his suspicious interactions with certain staff. A nurse admitted to overhearing cryptic conversations about prepping patients. A former officer recounted Jack's history of misconduct, detailing incidents that were quietly swept under the rug. Through it all, Jack sat stiffly, his shoulders squared, occasionally shaking his head as if in disbelief. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered under his breath at one point, earning a sharp glance from his lawyer. But as the evidence piled up, cracks began to show. His hands fidgeted on the table, his forehead damp with sweat. His once confident demeanor was unraveling. The prosecutor's voice rang out again. "Your Honor, I call Tanya Wells to the stand." Tanya rose from her seat, her composed demeanor drawing the attention of everyone in the room. She took the oath and sat, meeting Jack's gaze with an icy stare. "Miss Wells," the prosecutor began, "can you recount your encounter with the defendant?" Tanya's voice was steady as she described the parking lot confrontation, detailing Jack's aggression and the moment he struck her. "At the time," she said, leaning forward slightly, "he didn't realize I was undercover." The courtroom was silent as she added, "I was the crippled woman he assaulted, and now I'm the one exposing his crimes." Jack's face was drained of color, his mouth opened but no words came out. For the first time, shame and fear flickered across his face. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This man abused his power, hurt innocent people, and orchestrated heinous crimes. The evidence speaks for itself." Jack slumped in his seat, his defiance shattered. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. Justice was finally catching up with him. The case was adjourned, and everybody went home, except for Jack, who was locked away in some place. If you are proud of how Tanya has handled herself so far, and if you believe that one should not judge a book by its cover, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story when it drops. On the final day of Jack Reynolds' trial, the courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the judge entered, the jury already seated. Jack sat at the defendant's table, his once proud posture slumped, his eyes fixed on the polished wood in front of him. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood as the judge took her seat. After weeks of testimony and irrefutable evidence, the moment of truth had arrived. The jury foreperson rose, a solemn expression on her face. "In the matter of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. In the matter of assault, guilty. In the matter of organ harvesting, guilty. In the matter of conspiracy, guilty. And in the matter of murder, guilty." The words hit Jack like a sledgehammer. His jaw tightened, but his face betrayed the storm of emotions raging within. A murmur swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Order in the court," she commanded. Turning her gaze to Jack, she delivered the sentence. "Jack Reynolds, you have been found guilty on all charges. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps and whispers rippled through the spectators, but Tanya Wells remained still, her gaze locked on Jack. She had waited for this moment, not for vengeance, but for justice, for her brother, for the victims, and for the lives torn apart by Jack's actions. As the bailiff approached to cuff him, Jack finally looked up. His eyes met Tanya's, and now, He saw her not as the crippled woman he had assaulted, but as a formidable force who had dismantled his life with precision and strength. Her calm, confident stare cut through him like a blade. As he was led toward the exit, the whispers of the crowd faded into a dull hum. Jack glanced over his shoulder one last time. Tanya stood tall, her expression unreadable but resolute. Her unwavering strength was a stark contrast to his crumbling facade. Jack lowered his head, consumed by the weight of his actions and the knowledge that he had underestimated the very person who had brought him down. Tanya went home fulfilled, and as she sat on her worn leather couch, the soft glow of the television illuminating her modest apartment, the news anchor's voice was steady, but charged with significance. Former police officer Jack Reynolds has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial revealed his key role in a sprawling organ harvesting ring that victimized countless individuals. This verdict marks a major victory against corruption in law enforcement and the medical field. Tanya leaned back, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The weight she had carried for years felt lighter now. She reached for the remote and turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. Her gaze shifted to a small photo frame on the coffee table. It held a picture of her and her brother Jamal, taken years ago at a family barbecue. His easy smile and warm eyes stared back at her, a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost. "I did it, Jamal," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. She picked up the frame, running her fingers over the glass. "I couldn't save you, but I made sure no one else would suffer like you did. They paid for what they did to you." Tanya set the photo back on the table, her resolve hardening. She wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. Corruption was a persistent shadow, always lurking, always waiting for an opportunity to grow. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Her eyes drifted to her desk, where her CIA badge gleamed under the light of a small desk lamp. Next to it was a thick manila file labeled Next Mission. She reached for it, flipping it open to reveal another web of connections, names, and locations. Another case to crack, another battle to fight. Tanya closed the file, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and often thankless, but it was also necessary. She stood, stretching her arms and glancing once more at Jamal's photo. "I'll keep going," she promised, her voice firm now. "For you, for everyone who can't fight back." The camera of her surveillance system beeped softly in the background, a reminder of her ever-watchful eye on the world. Tanya grabbed her badge, clipping it to her belt, and tucked the file into her bag. As she stepped toward the door, the camera lingered on the photo of Jamal, the badge, and the file. The fight wasn't over, but Tanya was ready. Justice, after all, was what she did best. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming stories like these. The end.